You'll have to pardon me. English is not my first language. I am Navajo, raised in the traditional way. I still live on the res, and I got a story to tell you. I got invited by my cousin to hang out and play video games with him. Now, my cousin, well, we didn't drive since we were only 13, maybe around 14. However, I had a small dirt bike that my family had gifted me. It was a janky thing, always needing fixing, but hey, it got me from point A to point B when I needed it. At least sometimes it did. The sun was already pretty low behind the hills, and it would be getting dark in about an hour or so. Before I left, my mom gave me the same speech as always, just like everyone else does on the res. Do not be wandering around at night. Do not do things you're not supposed to be doing. And if you see or hear something, ignore it. But being a young teenager with a sense of curiosity, well, you'll see what happens. The journey from my mom's place to my uncle's trailer, which was where my cousin was at, took about 30 minutes on a good day. The back way was a path that led through a dense wooded area with steep rocky hills. Then, I had to pass through the back of my grandma's sheep camp, which also housed a few goats at that time. And after passing by the sheep camp, I would have to go through another small wooded area. The entire way was a challenge, especially when it would start to get dark. Why? Well, it got dark in between the trees, in between the wooded areas. But in this case, I was taking my dirt bike. It was kind of sketchy driving into the pitch black with nothing but a small flashlight. And I didn't want to be alone, so I called out to my dog Rocky. He would go anywhere with me if I let him, and he was a good boy. As I passed by the first patch of woods, I made it into my grandma's sheep camp. There were a bunch of goats, but they were all tied up. Goats can be creepy as hell, with their eyes and the way they just stare at you like they know something. Well, these were just standing there, being creepy as always. As long as they didn't start standing up on two legs and speaking, we should be good, I thought to myself. But just as I was starting to shake off the unease, my dirt bike suddenly stalled out right next to the camp. I checked everything to see what was wrong with it, but it wouldn't start. Rocky was next to me until I noticed that he started growling at something. Rocky had never shown aggressive behavior towards animals. He used to even herd both cows and sheep, but as soon as that happened, I stopped dead in my tracks and tried to look around and listen. He seemed to be growling towards the goats, but I couldn't see why, and I wasn't going to stay there any longer. I flipped the bike to neutral and started pushing it up the little slopes. As I came across the second wooded section, it wasn't quite nighttime yet, but being surrounded by this small patch of trees made it seem darker than it actually was. As I was pushing my bike, that's when I heard my name being called from the woods. It sounded like a man, but it sounded like he was whispering really loud. I called for Rocky and he came running right beside me. However, he started growling from where the noise was coming from. I started pushing a little bit faster as I wanted to get out of there, and that's when I heard what sounded like footsteps running towards me. I started to pray and push faster to get to my uncle's trailer soon. I didn't want to look back because the last thing I wanted to see was one of those downed goats walking on two legs. Just then, I saw the porch lights between some trees, and all of a sudden, my bike started up by itself. I quickly zoomed out of there. I got to my uncle's place, all sweaty and dirty. I stood by the door to cool down, and my uncle looked at me with concern and asked if I was okay. I just nodded my head. I spent the night there with my cousin, and it was a chill night. The next morning, I received a text from my mom saying to come home before nightfall. I ended up spending the morning and afternoon with my cousin and uncle, and before I knew it, it was getting dark. Knowing our culture, you obey and listen to what you're told. So I quickly rushed to get home before it got completely dark. My uncle offered to take me home, but I didn't want to make things complicated with hauling the dirt bike, and Rocky also being inside a car. My uncle wasn't a big fan of dogs. Plus, by the time that I was ready to go home, he was already going to sleep. I said bye to my cousin and told him that I would talk to him soon. As I headed back, it wasn't fully dark, but I know it was going to get dark soon. On my way up, I passed by the first patch of woods with no incident. After I got to the sheep camp again, that's when the bike gave out. I'm sure it was something to do with having to go through the uphills, and I had to let it rest a bit. Either way, I wasn't going to stop here, so I put it in neutral and started pushing again. As I started walking with it, that's when I noticed the creepy goats again far in the distance. Not only that, but that's when I noticed that one of them was on the fence about 20 feet away from me, just staring at me. However, this one was different. It had no eyes, well, no pupils. Slowly getting near it, my dog started growling towards it. The weird part is that it paid no attention to Rocky, and it just kept staring at me. I yelled out to Rocky, but that's when he ran towards the goat, jumped the fence, and somehow snapped its jaws into its neck. I swear all of this happened in less than a split second. You know that movement that dogs do when they lock their jaws into something and start shaking it? Well, that's what my dog started doing. The goat fell to the ground, and I swear, it started making some horrible screams. How the hell am I going to explain this to my grandma about what just happened? My next reaction was to get out of here. I kicked my bike a few times and the down thing turned on. I looked over to Rocky and saw that he had ripped the throat out of this down goat. I sped off and called out to Rocky. I got on my phone and called my cousin, who woke up my uncle and told him what happened. My uncle wanted me to describe the goat that was dead, and I explained its features. Black shaggy hair, no pupils. It was just plain black. My uncle then got quiet and told me to go home and pray. He said he would go over in the morning to check it out. I then made it through the sheep camp, and I made it to the next section of the woods. Coming up to the steep rocky sandhill that required first gear only, I looked back one more time to see Rocky coming up behind me, running. But that's when I also saw it. Behind Rocky, this damn same goat was running a few meters behind him. It then started screaming, a sound that will forever be burned in my brain. It started screaming like if it was a man, but not just a man, like a person who was choking or coughing up blood, trying to speak and say something at the same time. I could hear its raspy breath with each step. It gave me a shot of adrenaline. I started screaming at Rocky to go faster, and at the same time screamed at my bike to go faster as well. I looked back one more time, and this goat was now running on 2 legs. I pushed to 4th gear and zoomed out of there, not looking back. I ran inside my home, and Rocky ran towards the backyard. I got inside, and as soon as I did, my mom held me for a minute. She said my uncle had called her and told her what happened. She told me to hop in the shower and that she was gonna wash off Rocky, and that tonight we would all be spending the night in prayer. We did end up spending the night in prayer. Even my dog was brought indoors, and that's saying something, because my mom never allows dogs inside. My mom also revealed to me that the previous night, when I spent the night with my uncle, she heard something walking by the window of my room, scratching at it. I told her what happened that night on my way down to my uncle's place, and what happened just earlier on the way back. Nothing happened that night, but the next morning, my uncle called my mom, and he told her that he couldn't find any blood or anything about this goat that Rocky had killed. Well, of course he didn't. Now, outside of this, the strangest thing is that a week later, on one morning, Rocky was nowhere to be found. I know that dogs sometimes wander off when it's time because of age or sickness, but Rocky was healthy, strong, and only 5 years old. I never did find him. I know this isn't the ending that you expected, but it's part of living on the res, where there are people who practice bad medicine. From what family and friends have told me, they said that Rocky was either killed or taken, and that he actually took what was meant for me. I stopped going through that back path, especially close to nightfall. Whatever this thing was, It never bothered me again. Well, at least not here. Maybe I'll tell you another story some other day. If you ever come to the Navajo Nation, be careful if you see an animal acting strange, especially at night. You know, the more I think about it, the stranger deer seem to get. They seem peaceful, very gentle, that we often see grazing in meadows or going across the road. But after some of the encounters I have experienced, I don't look at deer the same way anymore. There's just something about them, something that makes me wonder if what we see on the surface is all there is. Maybe they're not what they seem to be. Maybe there's something lurking beneath those eyes, something that we can't quite understand. Or maybe there's something else out there in the forest, something that uses these creatures as a disguise. Or worse, something that twists them into something unrecognizable and terrifying. I've seen and heard enough to believe that deer are far from the simple animals we think they are. And while these thoughts might make you second guess that peaceful stroll through the woods, I'm not done yet. I got more stories to share about when I was a park ranger. Stories that might just make you rethink what you know about these things, these deer. So I once saw a deer mother bite one of her fawns by the head and then start shaking it violently until its neck snapped. She then dropped it to the ground and nudged it a couple of times as if she didn't quite understand what she had just done. I didn't continue looking because I was a bit freaked out. One time, I found a dead deer lying next to a tree. The markings on the tree and the markings on the deer's head suggested that it rammed its head into the tree's trunk until it died. So I ended up taking a blood sample, and when I analyzed it, it was completely healthy. One time in the winter, I stumbled upon a fresh kill. It was a deer with half its face missing. Its neck was all jacked up, and it had a huge hole where the guts were hanging out. As I was starting to poke the wound to check the temperature, the thing let out a yelp and rose to its feet, in complete disbelief as this bloody mess turned its head to look at me and started walking away calmly. It then dropped dead about 10 meters and didn't get back up after that. It can be pretty exhausting to remember these memories all the time, but I have another story for you. I've been seeing a girl for a couple of weeks. For some reason, she found my job to be hot and thought that I was some sort of macho dude. I went along with it because she was also cute. She also hooked up Peter and co-worker with one of her friends. She lived in one of the fancier houses in town with a nice view of the forest from her living room. We decided to have a double date at her house where we would watch a movie and eat dinner. Peter and I hadn't been into the forest that entire month. We had just gotten caught up in our own personal lives as well. Honestly, it felt nice to get a break from work, seeing as how we weren't exactly ever off duty. We fell asleep on the couch in the living room. At some point during the night, I woke up. It was a beautiful night, so I walked up to the glass door in order to get a better view of the sky. After a few minutes, I spotted something in the distance. The faint glow of eye shine from something staring intensely back at me. I froze in place and observed this unknown creature as it slowly started walking towards me. When it got within the light that was coming from the house, it revealed itself to be a medium-sized red stag. It just kept walking towards me, didn't blink or take its eyes off of me. It walked directly into the glass, which actually seemed to puzzle it a bit. It then started nudging the glass, which turned into violent pushing. At this point, I started backing away, still in complete disbelief about what was happening in front of me. My girlfriend wakes up due to the loud banging on the glass. "What the fuck is going on?" she asked, still half asleep. Before I could answer her, the stag started letting out these guttural screams. As it also intensified its ramming, it broke through the glass. My girlfriend screamed, and Peter came running down the stairs to see what was going on. The stag just calmly walked up to me like it hadn't just broken through a glass door. keeping those horrible noises going as it approached me. I tried backing up but stepped in some glass and fell over. The stag just continued looking at me with unflinching eyes as it continued letting out those guttural screams. My girlfriend was still screaming also at this point. The sound of Peter unloading his small sidearm. He hit the stag a few times but mainly missed, leading to a lot of property damage. The stag fell on the floor. And to this day, I'm still grateful to Peter for bringing his gun. The girlfriend and I broke up the next day. She said that I was either cursed or unlucky. Either way, she didn't want anything to do with me. I still always sleep with my blinds on. I never want to see another window in the night, especially when I know what might be on the other side of that glass. I may have ignored the forest, but I know it didn't ignore me. I once found myself lost with Peter in a snowstorm. We were basically as lost as we could be, with no shelter or any way to start a fire. Snow was falling so densely that we couldn't even see more than 5 meters in front of us. The wind was so cold that my lips started bleeding. We drove around for what felt like an eternity until we came up on this old hunting cabin. We had such a hard time getting off our ATVs because our clothes had frozen solid just on our backs. I still remember how Peter was shaking and clacking his teeth. The cabin was completely empty, but had a simple fireplace and some dry wood. As we sat there, still warming up by the fire, we had a moment of dread when we realized that we might actually die here. We had no idea how long the storm would last, and there wasn't a whole lot of wood for us to burn. Peter then rose to his feet and said, "Fuck it, wait for me here." He went outside and returned a few minutes later with an axe. For a brief second, I really did wonder if he was going to put me out of my misery. To my relief, he started beating the ever-loving out of the floor. We ended up using the boards as firewood, which kept the fire going for a bit longer. Bless you, Peter, and your smart brain. In the end, we most likely burned about half the cabin's floor, which revealed more and more of the cold dirt underneath. And of course, there happened to be the remains of a couple of people down there, who were also waiting out the storm stuck in this murder cabin. The remains looked very old. We seriously debated if we should leave or stay, but we chose to stay because we would have a better chance of surviving against a psycho killer than the actual storm. At one point, we heard someone approaching the cabin, only to run away into the wilderness. It makes no sense because only a mentally deranged person would have the balls to wander around there at that time. Then again, we were in a cabin with dead bodies underneath the floorboards. We sat with our rifles ready, just in case. After a long time, the storm started winding down. We came out from the cabin, dug out our ATVs out of the snow, and made our way back into town. Navigating was a lot easier now that we could actually see where we were going. We immediately went to the police station after this. They were surprised to see us since they had already reported us missing or dead. We told them about the cabin and agreed to show them the next day. I slept for about 14 hours after soaking in a tub of hot water. The best sleep I ever had in my life. We met up with the officers and took them through the forest to the cabin. It was gone. There was no trace to be found. The trails left behind by the ATVs were still very clearly there, even the spot where we dug them out, but the cabin itself just wasn't there. There was a clear area where it was, but there was nothing but a fresh layer of snow. The officers looked irritated and said that we were wasting their time. They said that we must have been hallucinating, that we drank too much of Peter's home brew. It still makes no sense to me, and we never found an explanation for that. In early fall, Peter and I came across a hunter who was panicking. He begged us to help his friend who had been attacked by a bear further up the trail. He drove with us up to the incident where it occurred, but it was already too late. His friend was all messed up beyond belief. His face was ripped off, he was gutted, and his limbs were all twisted in unnatural positions. I almost threw up on the spot. We decided that this bear was too dangerous to be left alive, since it was roaming fairly close to town. We started looking for tracks to get an idea of where it was going. The hunter was just sitting up against a tree, too shocked to react to what was actually going on. We kept describing the creature as a bear when we asked them. But here's the crazy thing. We only found deer tracks at the scene. Against our better judgment, we started tracking them. I swear there was a constant stream of cold sweat running down my back while we were busy hunting this. I would honestly have been rather be tracking a bear at this point. We got to a clearing at some point when we found a piece of the guy's face hanging from a bush. Freaked out, we had to continue on. And finally, we caught sight of it. It was wandering around in circles, almost like its internal compass was messed up. This time, I was the one who shot it, and I couldn't let Peter have all the fun. I hit it right in the head. Instant death. Chunks of flesh were still hanging from its antlers. We had to actually collect the individual pieces and put them in a plastic bag so that we could deliver them to the morgue with the rest of the body. Of course, we gagged as we did it. It was one of the most horrible things to do. We ended up driving the hunter back with us so he could deliver his testimony. "Why did you tell us it was a bear?" Peter asked him. "You would have never believed me," he answered. "If only you knew." Peter and I were hanging outside his apartment one night, sharing stories and drinking. We sat down on a small balcony and smoked when we got a call from the police station. There had been some strange sightings of an animal, most likely a bear, roaming the area. Some of the locals were pretty scared and had reported it to the police. Of course, it fell under our jurisdiction, so we decided that we would just check it in the morning. We didn't feel like chasing some large creature while half drunk, and the sun had just gone down. We sat for a few more minutes, just talking, when a screech echoed from beyond the tree line. We were silent for a couple of minutes. "Fuck, that was loud," Peter said, and so we decided to go check it out. Operation Half Drunk Hunting commenced. We wandered around aimlessly, randomly pointing our flashlights and rifles right in the dark. "You gotta be fucking kidding me," Peter shouted. He had found another set of footprints of a deer. "Don't tell me this is another fucking deer. I swear." He sounded both angry and scared. We then hear rustling behind us, and we both turned and aimed at the sound. Two glowing eyes reflected our flashlights. It let out a loud squeal and charged at us. We both ended up shooting it. It was a boar. It was so big that we initially thought it was a bear. "At least it wasn't a fucking deer," I said. Peter let out a nervous laugh and shook his head in front of this huge animal that was before us. Honestly, we didn't know what to do with it. We hadn't brought our ATVs and the thing was too heavy to carry, so we decided to just leave it there. The wolves can scavenge it. The police actually believed us this time. Some of the hogs out there can grow to enormous sizes. Great. Fucking great. Most people don't know this, but there's a bunch of unmapped, unexplored cave systems all around Russia. There is also the case from where I lived. It wasn't uncommon for Peter and I to stumble upon a cave or two while we were going around. Lots of local legends surround the caves, like an underground city of people, witches, prehistoric animals, and so on. Whatever the case, I always found cave systems to be fascinating. It's like entering a new place where the same rules don't really apply. So when the police managed a rescue team to help a teenager who had gotten trapped in one of the caves, I didn't hesitate to volunteer. At this point, Peter and I were liked enough by the police that they kind of trusted us and included us in some of their work. Peter didn't come along this time because he was too hungover. As the case stood, two teenage boys tried to explore a local cave system that had some very steep drop-offs. One of the boys had lost his footing and tumbled into the darkness. He was alive, but had broken his ankle and couldn't get out. Instead of getting stuck himself, his friend had just chosen to send for help. I made my way through the cave, making sure to watch my step. The cave floor was very damp and covered with something, so it wasn't that much of a surprise that the boy had slipped. When we came to the drop-off, we shone a light on him. He waved and smiled knowing he was saved. I started descending the steep rock wall with a rope tied around my waist. When I got to the bottom, I secured the boy to the rope and gave the officers the signal to start pulling him up. He went that way, the boy said to me and pointed in a narrow passageway at the back of the cave. What do you mean? I asked, wondering if he had hit his head on the way down. My friend, he came back for me and he told me that he found an exit that way. I was confused, but I told him, your friend is up there with the others. His face went completely pale on the spot. But he was down here with me. He went that way. An uneasy feeling hit me, which I tried to ignore, especially because I was now the one stuck at the bottom. Well, that was until they threw down the rope again, and this kid was claiming that somebody was down here with him. For those few minutes I felt very exposed, and kept focusing on the narrow passage at the back of the cave. I pointed my flashlight to the ground and found some fucking footprints leading to the passage. Just very bare feet. I started panicking, but that's when they threw down the end of the rope and hit me right on the shoulder. I let out a scream because that's how scared I was. As they pulled me up, I refused to look back down. I got the fuck out of there as soon as possible. Whatever was down there, I didn't want to know. One of our biggest problems with poachers was that they would sometimes leave behind these heavy-duty rusty bear traps. Sometimes they never came back for them, which means that some parts of the forest could potentially be a minefield for some broken ankles. Sometimes we would find rotting carcasses that had become trapped in one and left to die. One time I almost stepped in one, but Peter noticed the chain in time to stop me. Thanks again, friend. We came across one of these traps, which had been sprung. Left in the trap was a boot with the foot still attached. The rest of the body was gone. A large pool of blood was left behind with bloody pieces of fabric. From what we could tell, it looked like someone had gotten stuck and then had his foot amputated. We followed the bloody trail but found nobody. He must have been with a friend who drove him out of there. The strange thing is that bear traps are fairly easy to break out if you know which of the pins to pull. The poor guy lost his foot because of some dumbass poacher. We ended up taking the foot with us and asked around the police station. They hadn't received any reports or incidents about a bear trap. There were also no records in the hospital. I assumed the guy didn't even go. This man must have been a poacher himself, or just one tough son of a you know what. We never did find him, or hear anything about somebody missing a foot. Still, finding a foot in the forest is never nice, especially when you know the type of stuff that's out here. Peter once showed me an abandoned settlement that he found back in the day. I was more of a city boy than him. He had always lived in the less populated areas, and he spent a lot of his younger years as a kid and teenager exploring the forest. He barely talked about these times because of his alcoholic father, who would beat him, and his mom, but he trusted me and sometimes opened up after a bottle or two. To him, exploring the wilderness was a way to escape from his home, which makes sense as to why he had a pretty good internal map of the place. We drove for a couple of hours until we arrived at the settlement. It looked all rotten and old as hell. Most of the buildings were made of wood and looked ready to collapse at any second. Some of this was your typical Soviet concrete that looked about as stable as our economy. Still, we chose to explore a bit, just in case. After all, this place would have been an amazing base for poachers. The houses were empty except for some damn furniture and a couple of stoves. The concrete structures, on the other hand, still had some interesting stuff lying around. We found some wet boxes of old dynamite, which led us to believe that this was an old mining town. Sure enough, there was a large quarry a few kilometers away. A lot of stuff that we found was too rusted to make out what it once was. Everything else was just in a state of decay that made it seem pretty unsafe for us to fool around with. It's not uncommon to find old abandoned mining towns that were never put on the map, so it didn't really take a second to wonder why they had been abandoned. That is, until we spotted the damn deer. Peter tugged on my shoulder and gestured to the right of us. There was a large stag watching us from behind one of the houses. The more we looked around, the more deer we noticed. There were about 10 or 12 of them just observing us. They didn't seem scared, but instead like they were making sure that we were on our way out of there. We slowly approached our ATVs as we noticed that they were following us, never blinking or making a sound. When we got to our ATVs, we debated whether or not we should just light them up, but we decided against it because we didn't want to hurt a bloodthirsty demon deer charging at us. We just started driving away, counting ourselves lucky, seeing as how they hadn't decided to fuck us up. I remember looking back once we were about 100 meters or so, and seeing well over 20 deer standing there motionless as we raced out of the area and back to town. I never went back, but we often talked about it. He firmly believed that the deer had something to do with the settlement being abandoned. I'm not so sure about that, but I definitely don't think it's out of the question. I swear, these deer and their mysterious ways. At this point, the police knew of our various encounters, but they didn't really believe us. They still had enough respect for us not to mock us. After all, we had retrieved quite a few bodies for them. That all changed when one of the officers, one of my friends, went missing. He hadn't responded to a call about some kids that claimed to have been stalked by an old man while they were playing in the forest. For some reason, he had gone out there alone to investigate. That was 16 hours ago, and nobody's heard from him since. Peter and I helped with the search since we both knew him quite well. We went searching for hours, but we didn't find anything. Then, someone found his handgun lying on the ground. It was fired twice, but we couldn't find the bullet casings. One of the officers had brought a dog. They took a few whiffs of the gun and started darting off into the woods, obviously tracing something. We followed as best as we could, but the damn thing was fast as hell. Suddenly, the woods were filled with the sound of aggressive barking and whining. We arrived at the spot where the dog had gone and found a big surprise, a big fucking deer. From one of its antlers hung the lifeless body of the officer. The deer had impaled him through his throat and out the mouth. It was so grotesque that I still get a lump in my throat when I think about it. It was my friend, and that fucking deer had killed him. It stood completely still, its head weighed down by the officer. The dog whimpered and started growling, but it didn't move an inch closer. One of the officers started shooting at it, which caused all of us just to light it up. Retrieving his body still stands clear in my mind as one of the hardest things I ever had to do. After that incident, the officers always took our claims serious. They even offered backup when we would go out. I still wonder about the original request though, about the old man. Was the story just made up? Did the kids just imagine him? Peter insisted that something supernatural was manipulating the deer, making them aggressive and batshit insane. I still lean more towards the theory that deer, just by their very nature, are batshit insane. We were checking out a potential poaching camp. When we arrived, we were greeted by two older men, who immediately started questioning us. We explained the situation to them, and we asked them to step outside so we could inspect their camp. It was a pretty standard camp with some fresh kills and pelts, but the men seemed really nervous anyway, like they were hiding something. We started asking questions until they cracked. They admitted that they had just shot and killed about 7 or 8 deer the previous night, but they hadn't retrieved a single one of the carcasses. They had simply fled the area. What kind of hunter kills animals just to let them rot? Why the fuck did you do it? Peter asked them with a sense of urgency in his voice. They explained that they had been sitting in the deer blind, waiting to take a decent shot at some unlucky deer. That's when they spotted one that was walking straight towards them, and when they aimed at it, they saw its eyes through their scope. It was just looking directly at them, but still walking calmly towards them. That's when they heard a twig snap and realized that their blind was being surrounded. All of them had the same lifeless look in their eyes. None of them made a noise or any sudden movements. And when they had just completely surrounded the blind, they started putting some aggressive expressions and began making noises at the hunters. Their blind was raised about 3 meters off the ground and supported by 4 wooden pillars. That's when the deer started ramming the supports while they were still screaming, shrieking, or whatever noise they were making. The hunters were scared and they just started shooting the deer one by one. They ran back to camp and they hadn't even been out hunting since then. They showed us the way to their blind, and sure enough, there were several deer carcasses lying at the base of it. There were visible markings on the supports, which actually backed up their claim. They asked us if they were going to get in trouble for what they had done. We told them no, as long as they didn't do anything with the carcasses, we wouldn't press charges. Normally, we would have made them pay a fee, but seeing that they had been through the same encounters with these demonic deer, we didn't make them pay a fee. In fact, we thanked them for taking care of them since they were a threat to the locals. We told them that if they ever encounter aggressive deer like that, they should put them down immediately. They looked a bit puzzled as we drove away, and we never saw them again. It all started when Peter got a terrible idea. He suggested that we find a central point in the forest, maybe by a lake or something, anywhere that deer were known to go, and then set up a blind in one of the biggest trees and camp out for a week or so, shooting any deer that seemed off. At first, I just called them a dumbass, seeing as our job was to preserve the wildlife rather than kill it. To be honest, I was also terrified of spending a whole week in the middle of nowhere. He called me a coward and told me that he was either going to go with me or without me. Of course, I wasn't going to let my best friend go through all that by himself for a whole week. He most likely knew that and used that as bait. We drove to the local hardware store and picked up the necessary equipment for our little project. Screws, wooden planks, ropes, and other things. I went shopping for other supplies such as canned food and water. We loaded up the ATVs with all of our gear and set off into the wilderness. I did wonder why Peter out of nowhere just wanted to do something so rash and stupid, but I figured that he was just fed up and tired of everything. I didn't really blame him, to be honest. But here's the weird thing. We actually hadn't experienced anything unnatural for almost half a year up to this point. Part of me wondered if he actually wanted to seek it out for some reason. He never told me why he decided to lead this dumb crusade against the deer, but I still ended up going with him so that I could watch his back. We eventually found a pretty big lake surrounded by big beautiful trees. It was early August, so there wasn't any danger to freeze to death while we slept. Anyways, we started building our blind, which ended up being more of a wooden platform, about 5 or 6 meters above the ground with a great view of the lake. By the time we were done, the sun was setting, and we had seen no sign of wildlife the entire time we were building our blind. But I figured it was just because of the amount of noise that we were making. Our plan had one huge flaw that we had forgotten to realize. The damn mosquitoes. We had no cover and were placed right next to the mosquito capital of this nation. We caught no sign of anything strange the first night, except each other's swollen faces. At dawn the next day, we awoke to the sound of something splashing around in the water. We peeked over to the edge of our blind and saw a doe along with her 2 fawns. We looked at them for about 15 minutes before we figured that they were pretty normal. Similar incidents happen every once in a while the first few days, but there was nothing else off. I felt relieved and wondered if they had migrated to some new place, planning on scaring some new rangers, but for some reason, Peter seemed extremely tense and would curse under his breath. "Peter, what's going on, man?" I asked. He looked at me with a hollow expression and sat up beside me. He explained that he had been having nightmares about the deer. He felt that if he killed some of them, he could prove to himself that he had nothing to fear. The poor guy hadn't had a decent night's sleep in well over a month at that point. He almost started crying while he told me these things, which really showed me how close this guy was to the edge. I had to help him, so I stayed with him and kept a lookout while he took a nap. I hadn't told him anything, but I actually been looking into how much it would cost to move away from this place. I hadn't said anything because I wasn't really planning on anything. Besides, I didn't feel like I could just leave him behind. I kept an eye on our surroundings for several hours and almost decided to just lay back and enjoy the view of the lake. But then, I heard something approaching to our left. Out of the tree line stepped a lone stag. I waited a bit to see if it would behave strange before I woke Peter up. It started bobbing its head in motion as if it was drinking from the lake, even though it wasn't anywhere near the lake. Well, that was more than enough proof for me, so I slowly shook Peter until he woke up. He instantly crawled over to the edge and looked at the deer, grinning with some kind of sadistic satisfaction. That's when he took aim at it with his rifle and fired at it. He let out a sigh of relief and started laughing. We heard the sound of several animals walking around within the tree line, but never saw any of them. It almost sounded like that stag had been bait to see how we would react. This only made Peter more paranoid. He was practically trembling with fear every time that we heard something wandering around in the tree line. Sometimes the deer would appear on the far side of the lake, but no matter how many times Peter and I shot at them, we never hit them. At night, our main source of light was a lantern that ran on petroleum. Part of me always suspected that this was a horrible idea, to use in a blind made of dry wood. On our 5th night into this crusade, things hit the fan, if you know what I mean. We kept spotting the eye shine of several animals, but every time we looked through the scopes, there was nothing. It almost felt like they were playing with us. Peter started firing shots into the air, trying to throw off the creepy efforts from whatever they were doing, but of course, it didn't work. I picked up the lantern and raised it higher in order to illuminate the ground better. When I stood up, I got lightheaded and fell over. I dropped the lantern, which in turn, as you guessed it, started a whole damn inferno. We abandoned everything and just descended down the rope. My rifle was up there along with all of my favorite gear. As we stood there in the night, the blazing blind illuminated a lot more than the lantern had. I still shudder at the thought. The largest flock of deer I had ever seen was standing in the tree line. All of their eyes lit up from the flames, giving them a hellish appearance. Peter was practically hyperventilating at this point, and we made a dash towards our ATVs. We hit the ignition and got the fuck out of there. We never did look back to see if they were following us or anything. The entire ride back, we just kept driving and letting out cries of adrenaline mixed with actual fear. When we got back, Peter just went home without saying anything. I went to my apartment and completely shut myself off from the rest of the world. I locked my door, closed the blinds, and turned off my shitty phone. I stayed that way for a couple of days. Then, I got the feeling to go grab a drink. I had already consumed every bottle of alcohol in my apartment, so I went to the bar that was located on my street. When I entered, I was met with worried looks from the people who knew me. "How you holding up?" the bartender asked me. This surprised me because none of them would have known about the stuff Peter and I went through the past week. "Well, could have been better," I replied. "Well, after Peter's accident, he just kinda disappeared for a while." "Peter's accident? What happened?" My expression made the situation pretty clear. "Fuck, I thought you knew," and he filled me in. Peter had packed his bags and rented some rundown car with the intention of skipping town. He then took off intoxicated and hit a tree at going about 80 miles. The car was total, and Peter died on the spot. After a few minutes of silence, I remember standing up and just walking out of there. I walked around aimlessly for hours, trying to make sense of what happened. Eventually, I found myself back in my apartment complex. I noticed a piece of paper hanging on my mailbox. I began to tear up when I read, "My dear friend, I have decided to leave this place. I can no longer bear the shadow that looms over us, and I hope you will come visit me someday. You helped me through some bad times, but this time you can't help me. If you decide to come over, you can find me at the address was blacked out. I cried for so long that it seemed like an eternity. I still tear up as I'm typing this. After about a month or so, I decided to move out of Russia and get a new start. I know I can never escape my past or the nightmares that keep resurfacing, but I have put a great distance between then and now. I still miss that crazy bastard every day, and I will never forget how much of an amazing friend he was. I now live in the safety of the heart of a big city, far away from any forest. I sometimes go on drives through some of the more scenic woods, but it feels so fake. The European forest doesn't have the same raw feeling as the Russian forest. I sometimes miss my old home. I just wish there wasn't an abundance of terrifying animals roaming the woods. I haven't experienced anything unnatural since I moved, and I have finally learned to sleep at night. I do speak with a therapist about some of the experiences I had, and I feel more in control of my fears now. Well, that's it. Believe it if you will. Either way, this is very real to me. Next time you get a chance, raise a glass to my best friend Peter in honor of his memory and the man that he was. Back in 2002, in West Virginia, I was 19 when my dad told me that Granddad had died. Not long after, we found out that he left me his old cabin. It struck me as strange because we never really talked, but I figure it was because we were the only ones in the family who really loved the outdoors. I had never been to the cabin before, but apparently, Granddad had lived there for a few years. He was the kind of guy who was super off-grid, hated the government, and loved the wilderness. He was a hardcore survivor type with plenty of guns, having served in the Korean War and developed a passion for shooting. In his will, he left me a note about the cabin's location and some other details. I decided to check out the cabin on Google Maps, but there was no visible path. The cabin was in the middle of a big open field. My dad convinced me that it would be a good idea to go out there, saying it would be a great way to remember Granddad. So I decided to take some friends along since it wasn't too far from where I lived, just a few hours. I headed out there with my buddies Carter and Jay. The only thing I had with me was the old Enfield rifle that my granddad had gave me when I was younger. Jay was always something special. He went all dressed out in a commie costume. Carter was a bit more normal, bringing an old bolt-action rifle. After a 3-hour drive, we finally got to the old road that led to the cabin. It was nighttime, and the snow was coming down, making it difficult to see anything beyond the headlights and the stars. There wasn't a moon, just darkness. We finally finished the drive down the old dirt road, and the headlights illuminated the cabin. It was much bigger than I had imagined. Think of a 2-story suburban house, but as a cabin. I figured that Granddad must have done some renovations that we didn't know about. We offloaded all of our things and went inside. There was no power, just a few candles lying around. But we had brought a ton of lights and a generator in the back of the truck. We left the generator outside, gassed it up, and started hooking up the lights. It only took about 20 minutes to get the inside of the cabin on. We decided that was enough for the night. There were only 2 bedrooms. Carter chose to sleep on the couch in the front room. I took what used to be Granddad's room, while Jay took the guest room. The room was dusty, but it was pretty comfortable. I set up all my gear inside, leaned my trusty Enfield against the nightstand, and went to bed. I switched off the lights and quickly fell asleep. Sometime later, I woke up to Jay, still in his full Chinese gear, shaking my shoulder. "What do you want?" I asked. "I just heard something crunching in the snow, and then the generator went off," he said. I tried to reassure him, saying it was most likely just a coincidence, but Jay kept insisting, "There's totally a person out there." I figured it might be someone messing with us, or maybe a hobo trying to scare us off so they could take shelter in the cabin. I asked if he saw anything out the window since we had placed the generator right outside his window. "Fuck no, I'm not looking out my window when there's something out there," he said. I called him a dumbass and told him to come help me turn the generator back on. I'm not going out there. Screw that. I'll wait till morning. I called him a coward and decided to go get Carter instead. I grabbed my rifle and flashlight and headed down to the living room to wake him up. Jay followed since his room was downstairs. As I was going down the stairs, I swear, I heard something crunching through the snow outside. I stopped, turned off my flashlight, and stood still. Jay was also doing the same. It was dead quiet, completely silent. No wind, no noises, nothing. Freaked out, I stayed still for another 3 or 4 minutes before I heard a sound outside. It wasn't close, but it was there. Jay whispered in my ear, "You hear that?" My heart was pounding, but I responded, "I hear something." I continued downstairs, nearly tripping over myself, and turned my light back on, raising my rifle. Carter was already awake, standing there aiming his rifle at the window. I turned off my light as my eyes adjusted to the darkness. I could see Carter staring down his rifle sights at the window. After about 5 minutes, he lowered his rifle. I turned my light back on. "There's someone out there," Carter said. I couldn't sleep, so I was watching movies when the generator went off. I saw someone walk by the window. They were on 2 feet, I'm pretty sure, and their eyes were at the top of the window, he explained. It hit me that the window was higher off the ground because of the cabin's foundation, like 6 feet off the ground. Whoever it was had to be at least 8 or 9 feet tall to be at the top of the window if they were human. "So are we turning the generator back on, or are we going back to bed?" I asked, trying to sound calm. I argued that if there really was someone out there, we should most likely confront them. But they kept making excuses not to go outside. "Fine, I'll do it myself," I said, annoyed. They did try to stop me, telling me that they were seriously freaked out, but I ignored them and went to the door. As I reached for the handle, a wave of fear washed over me, and I froze. After a moment, I broke through whatever trance I was in and slammed the door open. I scanned the area with my rifle and light, and for a second, I saw something moving in the woods. You have to understand, there was a solid 250 feet of field between the cabin and the tree line, and I had one of those powerful spotlights. The light only illuminated the edge of the forest, but I saw it. Something standing against the trees. It was pitch black, not just dark or a shadow, but like totally black, void-like, like a hole in the tree line. It reminded me of that paint that's so dark it absorbs all light. The thing stopped, and then I saw it turn its head. I raised my rifle and looked through the scope. My heart dropped. The thing was moving towards me, quickly closing the distance. It had already crossed about 75 feet. It then stopped, and I could see it more clearly now. It was still pitch black, but I could make out some kind of weird fur. Its eyes were a yellowish color. The creature looked like a Bigfoot that was starving. 8 feet tall, but super skinny. It stared back at me and let out this shriek, but a shriek that made my ears ring. My entire body froze. The thing then started sprinting towards me on all fours like something out of the game of Half-Life. I panicked and tried to pull the bolt of my rifle back, but I couldn't. I'm not kidding, this is what happened. Looking back on it, it's kind of funny, but at the moment, obviously, I was scared to death. Jay then came flying out the door in his full commie uniform, pulling out his Glock from his waist. He fired what must have been like 10 shots down range. I then saw the thing trip and roll. Carter started firing from the window with his rifle. Smart man. He stayed inside. I scrambled back through the door as quickly as I could. At this point, it sounded like downtown Detroit outside. The thing screamed and retreated into the forest. Jay rushed over to check on me since I had gashed my arm getting through the door. Carter was still at the window glaring into the woods. Jay bandaged my arm up, and we all sat in collective silence for what felt like 15 minutes. We decided to block all the windows with whatever we could find and barricade the door. Then we shoved the couch in the door. We all huddled in the front room behind a flip table, aiming at the door. About an hour passed when we heard something come up to the window beside us. Then it let out this ungodly screech that scared all of us. Everything went quiet for about 3 minutes except for the sound of crunching snow. We then heard what must have been about 2 or 3 more of those things approaching the door. There was a grunt, and then they all started pounding on the door. Carter stood up and fired 3 shots through the door. We then quickly decided to move upstairs and set up at the top of the stairs. After about 30 minutes, the banging at the door stopped. More screeching echoed through the woods, and then the creature finally retreated. All night long, they circled the cabin, screeching. It was horrible. We stayed awake all night just aiming our rifle at the windows and at the door. As the sun started to rise, the screeching faded into the woods. Complete silence followed for about 2 hours. I ended up passing out from being exhausted, and apparently, Carter also fell asleep. Jay ended up staying up. I woke up after about 3 hours of sleep, unsure if what just happened was real or just a nightmare. I laid in bed for a few minutes before Jay knocked on the door and came in. We talked about everything that happened. Carter came in too and told us we needed to get out of here, but then he also said, "This is our property. We need to kill these things." Jay and I agreed. Carter looked at us like we were insane. "These things are gonna kill us if we don't go," he insisted. We reminded him that we all had guns. "Fine, then give me a minute," he said. Carter came back a couple of minutes later with an HK-41 G3. "You had that, and you didn't even use it?" I asked. "My bag was on the couch, and I really didn't want to go near the door," he explained. We decided to go outside and try to set up lights and traps. We set up the lights without any incident. Jay pulled out 3 bear traps that he had taken from his dad, in case we went bear hunting. Why we would go bear hunting without dogs or proper equipment is beyond me. We did end up staying at the front door outside, feeling a bit more confident. Adrenaline is a crazy thing. We set up on the porch, and after a few minutes, we decided to fire some rounds into the woods. I fired 3 shots, and immediately we heard that same screech from the direction I was shooting at. They were watching us. We realized that they could see us or something, and suddenly, about 4 or 5 of the creatures started storming towards us. I hit one in the chest and it tumbled. Jay opened up with the Glock at another, which turned and ran back into the woods. Carter dropped 2 of them. One of them stepped into a trap, pulling it about 10 or 15 feet in one stride before it fell to the ground, and Carter and I just started shooting at it. After the chaos, I scanned the tree line with my scope. It looked clear. We cautiously approached the body of one of the creatures. Now for this part, I have to remember what Jay and Carter described, because my sense of smell is basically non-existent. They described the thing's smell as foul, like burning metal mixed with rotting flesh. So back to me, the one I had dropped suddenly started vibrating on the ground. We all freaked out and backed away. The shaking eventually stopped and we debated whether we should just head home. It was around 5 or 6 o'clock by then, and the sun was pretty much down. We decided to spend one more night and leave early in the morning. We bunkered up in the front room, taking turns to keep watch. I fell asleep during my shift and passed out immediately. I slept through the night and woke up in the morning. We all packed up everything. We moved the dressers back and left some stuff behind. We cautiously opened the door and stepped outside. I kid you not. All the bodies were gone. All 5 of them. Just gone. The tracks from the creatures running up to us were still there. But whatever came and took the bodies didn't leave any tracks. We decided to make a run for the truck since it was only about 50 feet from the house. When we got to it, we found that all the windows were broken, the tail lights were gone, and the truck was all dented over. "Screw this, let's go," Carter said. We all piled into the truck, turned it on, and floored it out of there, speeding through the forest. We reached the turnoff and got onto the highway. We were going so fast that I thought the truck was gonna explode. And after about 10 minutes, We got pulled over by the only cop on the highway. Everyone freaked out, trying to hide the guns as the cop approached. "What do you think you're doing going that fast on the highway?" We tried to explain to him what just happened, fully expecting to get arrested for being high or something. But then, the cop got really quiet. "You know the old man, don't you?" he asked. "He was my grandpa," I replied. The cop looked back at us and said, "I'll get it dealt with. Get it all cleaned up for you. I'll give you a call when it's all done." What the fuck? I thought. "Yes, sir," I replied. He told us to get out of town, saying that the creatures like to follow the scent, and the cops don't want people to freak out. We agreed, driving a more moderate speed the remainder of the way, only stopping once for gas. We finally made it back, and we went to our hangout spot to talk about what happened. We retold the story from all of our perspectives about 12 times, agreeing not to tell anyone else. Then we split up, and I went home. When I walked in the door, I heard my dad call my name. "Hey, you got a phone call," Dad said. "And by the way, I'm sorry, I didn't tell you about them. I thought they had left that area years ago," he said. I tried to get him to tell me what they were, but he refused, saying that the government would deal with it. And that was literally the first time I ever heard him say anything positive about the government. I slept for what felt like days after that. A few weeks later, I got a call from that same cop. How he got my number, I'm not sure. He says that they have to replace the entire cabin every few years to prevent those things from returning to the same area. He told me it's in the same place, but it's completely different. Only one floor, but also pretty long. He explained that Granddad used to help deal with those things, that he used to help the government kill creatures that like to kill people. The cop did call them blackies. He also made sure to tell me that they weren't human. He wished me good luck in my future plans, and I returned the wish before he hung up. This was all 20 years ago. I'm now telling the story for the first time because I wanted to get it off my chest and hear what others think about it. I honestly don't believe it was a Bigfoot, Skinwalker, or Wendigos. Whatever it was something far less known. I only been back to the cabin twice since then. Once with the same two guys and my girlfriend, and once by myself. The cabin was different every time. Hey everyone, I'm a huge fan of all scary things, and even the unexplained. I even have my own YouTube channel, where I post interviews that I have done with people who have experienced any sort of paranormal activity. However, there is one thing that I've always been, quite a skeptic about, and that is skinwalkers. I mean, witches who transform into animals, and apparently are only confined to a specific area within America. To me, it always sounded like the typical legends and stories about the boogeyman, that parents tell you about. However, there are some events that have been happening that have actually made me doubt everything. And now I'm sharing this story so that you all can avoid what I did, and also see if anyone out there can actually help me. My friend Zanny is of Navajo descent. He always shared cultural insights and stories of the res with me. It was during one of our discussions over text that he first introduced me to the legends of the Skinwalkers. He said something about shape-shifting humans, and with curiosity, I gladly accepted his invite to visit the res. Being a YouTuber or media creator, I plan to stay for a week, hoping to go deeper into these stories, do some research, capture photos of notable sites, and gather first-hand accounts from the locals. The res was unlike any place I've been to. With its landscapes perfect for photos, it was both beautiful and eerie. Over the first few days, I kept finding myself busy, from visiting the local trading post, hanging out at community events. I learned about their daily lives, taking photos and setting up casual interviews with all sorts of people and the locals about these so-called skinwalkers. However, of course, the people of the rest met my questions about skinwalkers with different reactions. Some would actually cast their eyes downward, offering nothing more than a no comment. Others stared back with a stern look, warning me of the consequences of prying too deep into the things that are best left alone. Yet, a few brave souls did share stories about so-called coyotes who transform into humans. Apparently, they can mimic certain voices and animal sounds. How one should not whistle at night, as it's believed that this might actually invite or summon a skinwalker. So during my time there, I stayed in a hogan that belonged to Sandy's grandma, but at the moment nobody was staying in it, except for Sandy. For those unfamiliar, a hogan is a traditional Navajo dwelling place, constructed from a mixture of logs. There's actually some spiritual significance for the Navajo. It's almost like you can feel a connection to the land, and the door to the hogan always faces east to greet the morning sun, which apparently is important in their daily rituals and traditions. After my string of interviews and questions on the res, word seemed to have traveled fast. On the 5th day of my stay, I was outside the hogan trying to capture photos of the beautiful sunset when I noticed an older man approaching. He moved with a slow pace, and his clothing was traditional, and around his neck were hanging all sorts of amulets that were making noise with each step that he took. Zanny, who had been inside the hogan, stepped out and immediately went silent upon seeing this man. He whispered to me, "That's Tahoma, one of the respected medicine men around these parts." Before I could ask more, Tahoma was already within earshot, his piercing eyes set deep and locked with mine. "You're the one asking about those whom walk on all fours," he stated, more than asked. I hesitated for a moment, taken back by his statement. Yeah, I am," I admitted, extending my hand in greeting. "I'm just curious about the legends," and he ignored my hand, cutting me off with a stern, "Curiosity can lead to places from where there's no return." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I was trying to keep the conversation going. "Hey, no disrespect. I'm just here to learn more about the culture and the stories." Tahoma stared deep into my eyes, as if he was studying my words. After what felt like an eternity, he spoke in a grave tone. "There are things on this land that you don't understand, that you cannot comprehend. With your questions and your cameras, you awaken things best left undisturbed." I gulped, the weight of his words pressing down on me. "Hey man, I apologize if I offended or overstepped," I said. He leaned in closer, and with a hushed voice filled with urgency, he warned, "Leave this place. They have taken notice of you, and they don't like you watching them." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving behind a silence. My friend, looking as pale as I felt, said, "When Tahoma speaks, we listen. I've been trying to tell you that these things are real, man." That night, the environment of the hogan felt different, more ominous if anything. Every small noise outside made me jump, and the once comfortable walls felt suffocating. I couldn't shake off the medicine man's warning, even though, to be honest, I didn't believe him. Despite the tension that hung in the air that night, a part of me still doubted most of these things. I hadn't personally witnessed any evidence of skinwalkers or the supernatural during my stay so far, and stories and legends were one thing, but tangible proof was another thing. The medicine man's warning, a little scary I will admit, could just be a way to dissuade outsiders like me from prying too deep into Navajo traditions, I thought. I'm not gonna lie, that night, all the Skinwalker talk had me a bit on edge. I guess the fact of being out here kinda didn't help. I had to use the restroom, so I stepped out the hogan and walked towards the dimly lit outhouse. As I was sitting down, remembering that next time to not indulge in other cultural foods so quickly, the distant sounds of the wilderness were interrupted by other noises that I started to hear, which were soft footsteps, the rustle of brush nearby, and the quiet creak of shifting dirt. It felt as if someone or something was slowly circling the outhouse, each footstep sounding closer than the last. Drawing in a silent breath, I waited, heart pounding, straining my eyes to see any trace of movement through the small cracks in the wooden structure, but I didn't see anything. Then, a tap at the door. Keep in mind this was around 11 at night, so I said out loud, "Hey, I'm in here." No response. Then, I heard what sounded like perhaps a dog scampering away on all fours, with the running steps fading into the distance. Well, that was weird, I thought. As I finished up handling my business, I slowly unlatched the door and stepped out, cautiously scanning the darkness. I kid you not. As soon as I took 2-3 steps, from behind me, I felt a force clamp down on my shoulder, causing me to jump nearly out of my skin. That's when I turned around, and I saw it. The face of Zanny, with a roaring sound and then a loud laugh. Catching my breath and shaking my head, I said, "Well, alright, you got me, dude," I admitted. He started to laugh, throwing an arm around my shoulders as we began to walk back to the hogan. "You have to admit," he began, sweeping an arm out and pointing to the landscape. "The rest is beautiful out here at night. Without the bright city lights, everything feels more alive, more connected." I took a moment to appreciate the beauty around us, the clear sky filled with numerous stars. "It's beautiful out here, Sanny, but I do want to let you know, it feels like we're the only ones out here. Some of these stories, legends, they just seem like traditions, to be honest, passed down to make sure that everybody respects the land." He looked at me, then nodded. "Well, that's fair. But some traditions are born from truth that has actually been forgotten," Sanny said as we continue our walk back to the hogan. On my last night at the res, I decided to indulge in a bit of mischief and to get back at Zanny for the prank he pulled. While heading back from the outhouse again, I tiptoed around the hogan, tapping gently on its walls and trying to mimic the eerie Skinwalker sounds I heard they made. I was hoping that maybe Zanny would start reciting a prayer that he told me that the people do whenever there's a Skinwalker around. I was waiting to see if Zanny came out, when I noticed little bundles near the hogan's base. With curiosity, I took out my phone and captured a few pictures, thinking it would add a unique touch to my video. And nearby, I saw stones, fixed in a way that seemed to be a ritual circle. I moved a few rocks to get a better picture. Then, laughing quietly to myself, and seeing that Sandy was not reacting to this, I began to whistle. And then, in a mocking demonic voice, I called out, "Zanny, it is I who walk on all fours." There was only silence. And after about 5 more minutes, and seeing that he still wasn't coming, I decided to take some last final shots of the beautiful landscape, as I knew this was my last night there. When I finally returned inside, Zanny was there, snoring away. I chuckled to myself, thinking, well, if a real Skinwalker ever shows up, you'll be of no help with that deep sleep. The next morning I said bye to Zanny and his grandma and thanked them for their hospitality. I also told Zanny I would contact him once I put a video together, and that before publishing, I would send it to him to make sure he was okay with it. When I returned home to edit some of the videos and pictures, I noticed that something was off. In the background of many interviews were shadows, flickering in and out of the frame. Even when I was trying to edit some of the interviews I had done, the audio itself sounded distorted, with what sounded like whispering echoes behind the words of those whom I interviewed. However, it was the pictures that really disturbed me. Every single image that I had taken, even in the daylight, had a faint shadow figure growing more and more clear with each picture. And the most scary picture was the last few that I took after rearranging those stones. The picture was supposed to be of the landscape, but instead there was a blurry silhouette of what looked to be a person. It had elongated limbs and also a twisted, unnatural posture. Nervously, I contacted Zanny, and after explaining everything, he went quiet, saying that he would ask the local medicine man for advice. The next day Zanny called. His voice sounded worried. He told me I might have caught the attention of something, and that he's communicating with Tahoma, the medicine man, to perform a ceremony. They believe it might help cleanse whatever I had caught the attention of. That same night, as I was asleep in my room, I was awoken by what sounded like whistling outside my window. I woke up half asleep, and I swear, I heard a voice coming from my closet, saying, "I'm in here," mimicking my response that I gave when I was in the bathroom that night in the res. I'm posting this here because, out of all the places on the internet, I figure this community might be the most understanding. If anyone knows what I can do to make things right, or how to protect myself, please let me know. I will provide an update tomorrow once Annie tells me how the ceremony went. But please, take this serious. I'm starting to panic as I'm typing this, and I swear, every time I glance at the dim reflection on my PC, when I change a window or tab, that distorted, twisted figure from that last photo I took seems to be standing right behind me. I was camping in the middle of nowhere in Washington. Not like an official campground, just way out in the forest where I wouldn't have expected another human for miles. One night, I wake up and hear something. I open my tent, and there is a guy sitting by where my fire had been right outside my tent. Nothing strange about the guy, just a normal looking dude, sitting there a couple feet from my tent. No backpack or anything with him, just a guy. He saw me open the tent, and his eyes got big, like he had just seen a ghost, and he took off. It shook me up pretty badly, but over the next day, I was able to put it out of my mind. After writing it off as just some strange occurrence, and a guy that was maybe high or something, and had somehow managed to set up a camp not far from mine. Then, 2 days after that, and 10 to 15 miles away in a totally different direction, that nobody could take the same path as on accident, I was sitting by the fire that night, and I started to hear noises that I got more and more convinced were a person. I called out to them, and out of the darkness someone was like, "Yo, do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?" I said no, I don't even think that's a real place there. They kept talking from just out of my line of vision. I tried to see them with my flashlight, aimed that way, and sounded kinda scared, and not wanting to piss off a potentially crazy person, I pointed the flashlight somewhere else. After like 15 minutes of being freaked out, and this person just talking and asking completely random questions, from the darkness, it sounded like the voice had gotten closer. So I ended up shining my light that way again. And it was the same dude who had been outside my tent 2 nights before. He must have followed me about 15 miles over 2 days. because there is no way he could have ended up in the same spot as me, as big as that wilderness is. No possible way. As soon as I shined my light on him, he took off again. I started to chase him but didn't want to get lost in the wilderness in the dark, so I stopped quickly after about 100-200 feet. This one couldn't be written off, because the only way he could have been in both places is if he was following me. I decided that the trip was over first thing in the morning, and ended up hiking back out over 3 days, always doubling back, trying to throw anyone following off my trail, and sometimes hiding and waiting to see if he would come by following me. I really can't describe how terrifying it was to feel like I was being hunted through the woods, and to actually have to brainstorm on things I could do to best avoid ending up being killed. On the first night of hiking out, twice I heard what sounded like a person walking circles outside my tent, but by the time I got the courage to look out, nobody was there. On the second night, I heard what I thought was an animal making noises at first in the distance, but I slowly decided that it sounded more like a human making animal calls. But it also could have been an actual animal, but I didn't actually see the guy again, but it really sounded like a person making noises. I basically cried when I finally got back to my vehicle. The relief was so strong. To this day, this was the most terrifying experience I ever had. I have no idea who the guy was or what his intentions were, but I just can't really articulate just what a terrifying few days it was. The whole situation was pretty intense, especially given that it went on for a few days. Like, imagine the feeling of noticing that there is someone following you in a dark alley, then stretch this out into 3 days and make it to where you have to sleep in the alley. And that's exactly what this experience was like. The feeling wasn't of being scared, but it was this constant knot in my stomach that someone out there was hunting me for 3 days. I grew up in Ohio in the 70s, and me and my childhood friend Joe were outside all the time we could manage. Joe lived on a farm that was next to a pretty big forest, and my parents would drop me off in the morning, and we would stay in the woods all weekend. We would only come out for school. We would be out there building shelters, traps, practice making fire with sticks. When we got to be in high school, we got this notion to pull a Stand By Me. This was based on the movie of the same name that had just come out. The idea was that we would walk the railroad tracks out into the country, but instead of looking for a dead body, we would find cool bridges to fish from and camp a little ways off the tracks. Of course, we knew this was dangerous and we would likely be trespassing. We had a lot of fun. We did find beautiful rivers. We discovered bridges no one went to. We fished. At night, we camped in the woods just near the tracks and made small hidden fires. Nothing bad ever happened. It was the best. In fact, it was so fun we did it a bunch of times and never had a problem. After high school, me and Joe went our own separate ways. We both ended up leaving home, but we always stayed in touch and always tried to coordinate visits, so we would see each other often. Well, one summer, in the mid-90s, it worked out that we were both in town for about a week. We would do stuff with family in the day, and at night, we would catch drinks at the bar or sit outside Joe's house around a fire and talk about the good old days. One night, me and Joe got to talking about our Stand By Me trips. Remembering these moments and drinking beer are a hell of a mix. Soon, we decided to take a day, walk the rails, camp one night, and walk home. When the day finally came, we started early in the morning. We had my wife drop us off in our old spot, where we used to always start, right outside our hometown. She thought this was absolutely crazy and made sure to mention it. When she pulled away, Joe said that instead of walking the usual way, we should take the opposite direction, just to be adventurous. We knew the land well, we had a map, so I gave a what the hell, and off we went. The day went fine. It was fun and a little sad, but in a good way. We found a bridge and sat on the edge, smoked a joint and moved on. We had no fishing gear, but we brought some canned food and more stuff. Before the night arrived, we picked a spot to camp. It was a thick forest area, trees on every side of the train tracks, so you felt like you were in a tunnel. We also brought small hammocks to sleep on, but before we set them up, we decided to do a little scouting of the area. Now, this is also something we used to do in the old days as well. We would walk the area around a little bit to make sure some dude's house wasn't just over a hill, and we were actually camping in their yard. We walked maybe 100 or so feet into the woods, and we also went up a small incline. We figured if we didn't see anything from on top of this short hill, we would be fine. But when we got to the top, we saw an old building down at the bottom. About 100 yards into the woods, it was barely visible. We pondered over what to do. We both assumed it was a sugar shack or something, because there didn't appear to be a clear road into it. From where we were standing, everything was quiet. No movement. Nothing could be seen. No lights. We decided to walk a little closer just to make sure. We came down the hill very slowly, and as we neared the building, we saw it wasn't a sugar shack at all. It was an old church. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. It was a squat, sagging building whose wooden planks were almost black from years of rot. A cross still stood on top of the place. None of the windows had glass and there were no doors, just open doorways. We got close enough to see inside, and there were rows and a section up in the front for a preacher to stand. We didn't go all the way in. We didn't want to. Beyond all that, there was no sign of anyone else, no footprints, no roads. It was an abandoned church. We quickly left and went back up the hill to our spot we had picked to camp. Having a hill between us and the church made us feel better, but we were still a little uneasy. We chalked it up to the natural creepiness seeing a church in the middle of the woods. Besides, at this point, it was dusk, and we just decided to rig up our hammocks and go to sleep and move on early morning. When the night came, we were laying down, and we began to hear something in the direction of the church. Our conversation about it went a little like this. Do you hear that? What the fuck is that? It sounds like people singing. And it did sound just like singing. We both slid right out of our hammocks and hunkered down, straining to hear more. We listened for a minute or two, and the singing continued. Finally, we decided to creep back up the hill and see if we could spy where the sound was coming from. We could still move very quietly in the woods from the old days. It was second nature to us. The moon was barely out, but it provided enough light so you wouldn't walk right into a tree. It was near pitch black, and we didn't use flashlights as we crept slowly up the hill, and we didn't even speak. When we got to the top, we saw a light in the distance. It was coming from the church, and the singing was coming from inside. Joe and I put our heads close together and had a conversation that boiled down to this. Can you believe this shit? The light looked to be candlelight from the way it flickered, and even though we tried, we couldn't make out what was being sung. It sounded like church music, but in a different language. We sat and watched for a while, trying to see who was there, but we only saw shadows. We had no intention of getting closer either. We had a lot of space between us, and we aimed to keep it that way. The singing continued for a bit, and then it stopped. After that, a male voice began to chant. I was already freaked out, but this voice scared the shit out of me. It sounded like some Old Testament preacher you see in movies, but again, it was like he was speaking in a different language, because we couldn't even understand a single word. Eventually, it got to where the single male voice would say something and then a bunch of voices would answer in song. This lasted for a while, and then they all broke into this long, sustained crying that just kept getting louder. It got so loud and so disturbing that I covered my ears. Then, it finally stopped. At this point, I was just getting ready to say, "Let's get the fuck out of here, man," when Joe put a hand on my shoulder and hissed, "They're coming out." We were far enough away that we couldn't make them out really well, but what we could see was a line of figures walking out the doorway, all holding hands in a single file. We could see some of them had flashlights. They began to sing again, and the light from the flashlights began to move towards us and the hill. That's when we booked it back down to our campsite, grabbed our shit, and ran to the tracks. Once there, we ran down the tracks in the direction we had come from. After a few minutes, we stopped and looked back. We saw lights coming down the hill. They were moving weird, like whoever was holding them was also shaking them. We continued to run and walk as fast as we could. We eventually stopped seeing the lights and came to a road. By our map, we knew a small town was about 15 minutes down, and we walked there, got to a 24-hour gas station, and called my wife to come get us. My wife and all her other friends just thought it was kids messing around, but I heard those voices, and they sure as hell didn't sound like kids to me. Not sure who those people were, but it was definitely the creepiest thing that has ever happened out in the woods. I try to live my life without too many regrets. I had highs and lows like everyone else in life, sure, but I do what I can to not worry too much about what could have happened if I made a different choice, if I maybe hadn't taken the road less traveled. Everyone makes the best decisions they can with the information they have available to them at the time. Going through all the what ifs is crazy, because the only way you would have made a different choice is if you had some other detail, which of course you didn't. You can never be exactly sure what the sequence of events might have looked like if you gone right instead of left. And yet, there is one choice I made, one road that I took, that I just can't help but wonder how things might have turned out if I had only done something different. My job has me move around pretty often. I'm not going to get into what I do. That has no bearing on the story. But a couple of years ago, I was working in Philadelphia and living on the other side of the Delaware River in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. I'm originally from northwestern Pennsylvania, and this was the closest I had been to home since I moved out of college. So I took the chance to go see my parents whenever I could. I knew I would be moving again before long, and my folks aren't getting any younger. So I try to find a weekend every month or so to make the 7-hour trip to visit them. If I had been thinking about it when I was looking for places to rent, maybe I would have tried to live on the west side of Philadelphia instead of this side in Jersey to avoid the rush hour. But by the time I realized, the lease was signed and there wasn't much I could do. The drive to my hometown was pretty boring. I would take the Ben Franklin Bridge across the river, head up I-476 for an hour or so, then a long slog across basically the entire expanse of Pennsylvania on I-80 before another hour north of I-79. The only thing about the drive was how long it would take me to get through Philly, because once I got on the 476 extension, I could predict my ETA within 5 or 10 minutes. My second summer in Jersey, I had taken 2 weeks off and planned on spending the second week back home. Things changed that first Wednesday though, because a big storm came by and knocked out power in a good part of the area where I was living. Dealing with 90-degree heat with no AC wasn't something I felt like spending the first half of my vacay doing. So after one uncomfortable sweaty night, I let my parents know that I was heading over a few days earlier. I should have left first thing in the morning, but because I had a couple of things to take care of before heading out, by the time I finally got on the road that Thursday, it was past lunchtime and getting on mid-afternoon. For whatever reason, the traffic in Philly was heavy, and by the time I finally got through town, I was a good hour behind schedule. Still, based on my timeline, I figured I'd still be able to make it early enough to grab a dinner and beer with my dad and brother before cashing in for the night. There were two things I hadn't taken into consideration. One was the number of other folks that, apparently, had the same idea to get out of town that I did, and that the road construction must have sprung up in the time since my last trip home. The interstate highway system is a heck of a thing. Being able to zip along at 65-70, or in some remote places like West Texas even faster than that, makes cross-country travel take a fraction of the hours it would otherwise. I can tell you the number of times my folks always talk about the days before the interstate, when going to see friends outside of DC would take almost twice as long as it does now. What's truly remarkable to me though, is that even though the entire system of highways was built start to finish in a mere 35 years, it sure seems like when parts of it go under construction, they stay that way forever. Traffic was heavy, but moving, and I was making decent time, until I saw the first orange warning signs, letting me know that 4 lanes were reducing to 3, and then 2, and then 1. There were hundreds of cones stretched down the road as far as the eye could see, and see I could, as the cars in front of me reached a complete and total standstill. It was one of the worst deadlocks I had ever been in. Seriously, I think I moved about a mile in about an hour. After about 3 hours, my stomach started grumbling. With an exit just ahead and no end to the traffic jam in sight, I got off and found a diner to grab some dinner. Even if traffic picked up, I still had a solid 5 hours of driving ahead of me. So at that point, I knew for sure it was going to be pretty late that I was getting in. After finishing eating, I got back on the road. Things looked like they were picking up for a couple of miles. But then, I came up to the back end of the jam and was right back to waiting. We were moving a little bit better, I think averaging about 5 miles an hour at this point. But as the sun started edging towards the horizon, I pulled out my phone and started to see if Google could point me in any kind of workaround. It's a funny thing about human nature. Most of us don't like to sit still. Studies at airports show that people would rather walk further to baggage claim to get their luggage, even if the total time would have been less if they had a slightly longer wait at plane side. Well, the power of the internet appeared to be in my favor. Even though I-80 still showed a dark red band for another 50 miles or so, there was a southbound country road coming up a few miles, and a northbound a couple after that. Both of these roads looked like they let me bypass the worst of the traffic. Since I spent the better part of the day sitting on the road, my patience was about worn out, and I opted to take the southbound road. Even though the app told me it would take about 30 minutes longer to get to my parents' house, I just wanted to get moving again, and reasoned that at this rate, it might take me more than a 35-minute difference to get to the northbound. And that is a choice that I will remember until the day I die. I made the turnoff and felt my mood improve. The signs changed, limiting my speed between 35 and 40 miles an hour. But even that seemed like flying compared to the logjam I spent the last several hours in. The drive was interesting. The road was starting to get a little twisty, with plenty of changes, as it curved up and around the hills of central Pennsylvania. It took me on a general southwest road, but turned and doubled back on itself enough that for the first 30 minutes or so, I had views of the stalled traffic on I-80. Pretty soon after that though, just about the time that the sun was just dipping down beneath a couple of hills in my rear view mirror, the road took a long curve and carried me down and away out of sight of the interstate. Now, something that a lot of people don't know is how big of a state Pennsylvania is. There are plenty of bigger ones, but Pennsylvania is really big, and it's also remote, isolated. The translation of the name means Penn's Woods. After all, the Blair Witch Project didn't have to embellish that aspect of the state. The fact that you could head into the woods and walk for dozens of miles in any way without seeing anything like another human being was pretty creepy. It's got a decent number of big cities. Pittsburgh and Philly both have enough of a population to support major sports teams, but away from those centers of development, there's a whole lot of nothing, and trees, and dark, and lonely roads. Such was the road I was traveling that night, winding through the twists and turns of the Appalachian foothills. I moved around a lot. I mentioned I traveled through most of the states anyways. I sometimes used to wonder, when I would be driving along a patch of asphalt, surrounded by only untamed wilderness, what it must have been like to build such a road. What was it like before man had intruded with our civilization and our machines? What used to live there? But I don't wonder anymore. Not ever since that night, when I made a left instead of right. The road continued to twist back and forth, up and down. As I went deeper into the foothills, the trees grew thicker, branches from either side of the road reaching over and almost touching, forming a natural canopy 20 feet up that blocked out much of my view of the sky and the stars above. I drove with my high beams on, because the idea of streetlights had never entered the minds of whoever built this road. The painted lines were old and not well cared for. I'd never been a good navigator. My parents used to say it was because, when I was a kid, my nose was always pushed into a book during car rides. But I think it's because I'm just bad at it. So it was that. There was no way possible I could be lost, as there were no other roads that I could have possibly turned onto and gotten off track. I also found myself more frequently checking my phone to ensure I was still on the right path, which is how I almost ran into the other car. My mind was wandering, thinking about the fact that my signal bars had dropped and remained at zero for the last 20 minutes, and what possible implications that would mean if I came across some kind of emergency. I raised my eyes back to the road after Google Maps confirmed for the 20th time that I was still on the right path. That's when my brain took a beat to process that I was approaching a vehicle stopped in the middle of the lane. I slammed my foot on the brake. I stopped in time, but not by much, with maybe 5 feet separating my hood from the other car's rear bumper. My heart was pounding in my chest as adrenaline coursed through my body, but my fear quickly gave way to anger. Seriously, what the hell was this guy doing? Not only was he stopped in the middle of the road, but all his lights were off. If I didn't have my high beams on, there was a good chance I wouldn't have seen him, even if I wasn't checking my phone. I could feel my heart beating in the vein on the side of my neck. I'm not somebody who struggles with road rage, and after a couple of quick seconds, I managed to get a hold of myself, not wanting to outright alarm anyone that might still be in the vehicle. I shifted into reverse and backed up about 20 feet, popping my emergency lights on. That's when I started noticing a few strange things about the stopped vehicle, more than just the fact that the lights were out. Of course, it was stopped in the middle of the road, but that wasn't unreasonable since there wasn't any shoulder that the driver could have moved onto. The strange thing though was that the doors were open, those on the driver's side crossing over slightly onto the other lane. And even more was that I saw that an item was dropped out onto the road by the rear driver's side door, something that appeared to be a child's stuffed animal. I considered my options, and after a few seconds, decided that I would have to go against my better judgment to just keep on my merry way and head outside to get a better idea of what was going on. I said earlier my job doesn't have anything to do with the story, which is mostly true. But before you judge my choices, it bears mentioning that I spent some time in the military. An obligation to help people has been drilled into me over the years, and I've seen enough things while deployed to feel I could handle myself. And so I got out of my car, but kept it running. I popped the trunk to grab the flashlight I keep there and left my headlights on so I could see what I was doing. I looked up and down the road, hoping to see signs of other cars approaching, but no luck. I called up to the other car as I cautiously started my approach, circling around to the left, to the middle of the road so I'll be able to get a look inside before I got too close. Anyone there? No answer. My headlights were helping, but there were enough shadows to still hide the car's interior. Shining my flashlight though, easily determined that no one was inside. I moved closer, stopping down by the rear door to pick up the falling object off the ground. It was a child's toy, just like I thought, a stuffed rabbit, with patches showing signs of frequent love. I frowned. If the folks traveling in the car had hitched the ride with somebody passing by, they would have taken the rabbit, or the kid would have been throwing a fit. I shut the rear door and moved up to the front. I put my hand on the hood and found it was still warm to the touch. That means it couldn't have been here too long. I slid into the driver's seat to try and figure out if there was some kind of mechanical issue that would have forced the car to stop, and was startled to find a set of keys still dangling from the ignition. Pressing the brake, I turned the key and the engine started right up. Headlights and the interior light in the roof springing to life. Fuel, oil, temperature, battery, all the gauges looked good. Not even a check engine light. Strange. Very strange. Then I saw the purse in the passenger seat. I picked it up, a normal brown shoulder bag, and briefly rummaged around before finding a wallet inside. Everything appeared to be intact, about $40 in cash, a couple credit cards, gym membership, Sam's Club card. The driver's license named the owner as Mary Walker, a pretty blonde that had just turned 30 the month before. There were a few pictures showing Mary in stage poses, sitting on a blanket under a tree. A huge, bearded lumberjack of a man hugged her from behind. A small ponytail girl with a goofy over-exaggerated smile on her lap. That's when I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. A shiver running down to the base of my spine. Something was very wrong with this situation. I put everything back in the purse and returned it to the seat. I turned off the car and got out, shutting the driver's door behind me. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and dialed 911, holding it over my head to try to get a connection with no luck. Cursing softly, I jammed the red end call button and moved around to the passenger side of the car. I played my flashlight around and noticed that some of the foliage at the edge of the road was bent and trampled like someone had walked through it. I didn't have enough woodcraft to be able to judge how long ago they might have passed, but even then, I couldn't imagine any scenario for why they would have gone wandering away. Shining my light into the woods, the beam only extended maybe 30 feet through the trees before being effectively swallowed by the greedy blackness. Looking at all the flat grass, at the stuffed rabbit in my hand, then at the dark trees crowding maliciously, my thoughts came back and forth between what I should do. I made up my mind. I had been trained to help people. It was hardwired into my system. There was a child somewhere in the woods. I raised my foot to take a step onto the path, and that's when a white flicker of movement entered the very edge of my flashlight beam. It was Mary Walker. She was naked and walking stiffly, unnaturally, her arms swaying out of sync with the rest of her body, like a puppet being manipulated by somebody who's not an experienced puppeteer. "Hello?" her voice called out. "Anyone there?" That's when more shapes came into view behind her, shambling along. Here, the bearded man who must have been Mary's husband, then their little girl, owner of the well-loved rabbit, both moving as strange as their wife and mother. And now, I could tell there were more, many more, their forms out of the direct light, but so many they caused the darkness to pitch and swell with their strange, staggering passage. Their voices a chorus. "Hello? Hello?" They called. "Anyone there?" Echoing back the questions I was asking only a few short minutes ago when I approached the abandoned car. I took a stumbling step back, away from the woods and the approaching figures. I ended up tripping onto the walker's car, but at that moment, I shone my light up into the pitch recess of the branches, and in doing so, I could just make out, barely, a sort of darkness figure that was crouched, hidden in the upper limits, a void even darker than the trees. Was it my imagination? Those lines of pure blackness that extended from that concealed mass that seemed to pierce the flesh of Mary Walker and her kin, and the countless other shapes moving in sync with them. That's when I sprinted back to my vehicle, engine still running. "Hello?" I shifted to reverse, keeping enough of my head to avoid running off the road as I completed a 3-point turn. "Anyone there?" I took a glance in my rearview mirror. The pale form of Mary Walker stood still just at the edge of the forest where the trees met the road. One hand was raised, signaling me to return, or perhaps waving goodbye. Her face was a mask of confused sadness. I pressed the gas and drove back the way I came. I didn't look back again. The rest of the trip was a fog. At some point after I made it back to the interstate, I called my parents. I let them know that I wouldn't be getting in until late. I drove on autopilot, the traffic jam having cleared while I was off. I thought about calling 911, but I didn't. What would I tell them, and to what end? There was no one left to be helped. I try not to go through life with too many regrets, wondering about what if, but this one, this choice. What if I had left earlier in the day? What if I hadn't stopped for dinner? Maybe I would have still gone left. Maybe I would have been there in time to help the walkers. Maybe I would have been taken by that black thing that was fishing in the darkness. What if I had gone right? Would I still be ignorant, going through life, unknowing that there are these things out there? I try not to think of it too often, but every now and then, all these thoughts turn to the stuffed rabbit. It wasn't until I reached my parents' house that night that I realized I still had that rabbit clutched in my hand. I used to wonder before man brought our roads and civilization? What was the wilderness like? What lived there? But I don't think about these things no more. I can't afford to. At least, if I don't want to wake up screaming. There are things out there in the woods, in the darkness, in places that humans still have not ventured out to. So be careful when you're out traveling, going into these country roads, and that no matter how bad the traffic is, always stick to the interstate. This just happened a few days ago, and I'm extremely shaken up. Some backstory first. I live on the second floor of a 3-level apartment. We have a crawl space that connects all the apartments. We aren't sure why it's there, but we all have stuff in it, and none of us would ever even attempt to go inside of it, so we still felt pretty safe. The other night, the sun was going down, but it wasn't pitch black out or anything yet. I'm walking through my living room when I see a short woman on my fire escape, looking into my windows. This is extremely bizarre, considering it's still semi-light out, and she must have literally gotten onto a fire escape somehow. We have 2 windows that the fire escape reaches, and she was looking in both, but didn't see me. I crawled onto the ground and my heart was racing as I watched her try to open the windows. I didn't know what the fuck to do because my phone was in the other room. After what seemed like forever, she finally left. I went into my room to get my phone to text my landlord and call the cops. I came back into the living room and was looking out the windows to see if I could locate her, when all of a sudden, I hear a weird noise coming from the ceiling. We had one of those tile ceilings made out of separate slabs of cork or wood. I looked up to see one of the slabs lifted up, and 2 eyes were staring at me. I have no clue how she got into the crawl space so quickly, but I grabbed the nearest thing next to me, which was a broom, and started hitting her with it through the ceiling, and called the cops as soon as she crawled away. They showed up and searched the place and didn't find her until a few days later, when she was on someone else's fire escape. The cops said she was definitely on some hard drugs, and that she was very violent. I'm glad she's gone. This was the scariest experience I ever had. Imagine some crazy lady coming through the ceiling as you're laying down in bed tonight, looking up. It was a Sunday early in the morning. I live in the suburbs, but my parents own a farm that I enjoy going to because I get to see my dog. Her name is Molly. She's a mutt, but she's not a tiny dog by any means. At that time, I felt very safe around her and would often take her for walks in the forest that was nearby. The day started off like any other. Me and my dad got in the car, drove around for a while, and arrived at the farm. I got out of the car and hugged Molly. My parents always got angry when I hugged her. This was simply because I would smell like her for the rest of the day. I put a leash on her and asked my dad if I could take her for a walk. He always thought that we would just go down a road and back, but I always found it more interesting to take her to the forest. I always felt a certain kind of peace and relax there that was unmatched by anything else. So we took a turn and headed to the forest. When we got there, I would take her leash off so she could explore on her own. Most of the time I would carve my name into the trees or look for anything else interesting. I was playing baseball with some rocks and a wooden leg, most likely from an old table, and then I heard it. Molly was barking at something. This wasn't normal when we were in the forest. I thought it was a fox or some other animal, so I quickly grabbed the wooden leg like a weapon. I knew that if it was a fox, I would attack it, but I had a sense of security when I was holding it. I called out to Molly, 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 but she kept barking. This was actually very strange for me, because she always came to me when I called her. I followed the sound of her barks and stumbled across a scene that I'll never forget. There was a man, most likely in his late 50s, half naked, carrying a large machete in one hand and holding moonshine in the other. This was the first time that I stumbled across someone in the woods, especially someone half naked and carrying a big-ass machete. He was completely ignoring Molly and hacking away at the ground for some reason. I didn't really know how to handle the situation. Even now, I still don't know how I would handle it. "Sir, are you okay?" I said, confused. I don't think I understood the seriousness of the situation at the time. He turned around, revealing his face. He had blue eyes I had never seen to this day. I could see them so well because they were wide open. "Come here, boy. Look what I dug up." I was afraid if I didn't listen to him, he would start chasing after me, and that was something I wanted to avoid at all costs. I got closer, but kept a good distance. I didn't see anything except for an empty hole. He returned to hitting the ground with his machete, occasionally taking sips from the bottle. I used this window of time to get my dog, and started walking away slowly, as to not notify him that I was leaving. But then, I took one final glance at the man, and this time, his head was dug deep in the hole. I was intrigued, so I kept looking. I know how stupid of me, but when he finally got up from the ground, I was shocked when I saw him carrying a bone in his mouth. I have no idea what animal it belonged to, if it even did belong to an animal. That's when I saw enough and started running with my dog. As we ran, I heard him laughing, and then I saw something flying from the corner of my eye. It was that damn machete. I heard him yell, "God damn it." This actually made me run even faster. I know the forest very well, so I wasn't afraid of getting lost. I went through branches and bushes until I got out of the forest. But I didn't stop running until I arrived at the garage, where my father was testing out lights on our tractor. I didn't tell him a single thing about the man, since I was afraid that he would get angry and wouldn't allow me to walk Molly anymore. Needless to say, I never, ever went to that forest alone, ever again. I've been running in these woods for as long as I can remember, but this encounter makes me change my mind. The story begins at around 6:30 p.m. I had finished eating and decided to go on a run, as I always do. I always use the same path, cross the street, run for about a mile, and pass the gate that goes into the forest. Something important to note is that the trail I used in the forest is separated about halfway through. One path is paved, and the other isn't. I always go into the unpaved trail first, and then turn into the paved one after about 3 miles. Nothing really ever goes wrong. I meet some people walking their dogs, but other than that I'm pretty much alone. At least, I thought I was. I had been running for a while now, when I heard a notification coming from my phone. A notification from AirDrop. Since I didn't want to make it look like I was worried, I kept running for a couple of minutes and then stopped to change the music. I opened the AirDrop dreadfully. Who the hell was sending me stuff? I was pretty sure I was alone. I clicked on the drop, and my heart sunk. It was a Snapchat picture of me running with the caption, "You look good." I didn't turn around. Instead, I kept running like nothing happened until I got to a certain point. You see, the forest is surrounded by a fence to stop children from coming in unsupervised, and I didn't like that rule when I was little, so my friends and I cut a hole in it. When I was aligned with that hole, I quickly turned and buried myself into the forest, aiming for my escape. I could hear something behind me, and I still didn't turn back. When I finally got to the hole, I jumped through it and absolutely booked it to the fire station that was a couple streets down. The last thing I could hear when leaving the forest was an angry huff and metal scraping against metal. I still don't know who it was or what they wanted from me, but I will never run in this forest again. Late at night, I go to the bathroom multiple times, but for the past 4 days, every time I go to leave, I can see myself still standing in the mirror from the corner of my eye. It's like the other me is watching me, leaving the bathroom. It terrifies me to the point where I almost run out without looking directly at the mirror. I never told my husband about it, because I didn't want to acknowledge it out loud. But today, I took a nap in our bed while he sat up in the chair next to it, watching TV. When I woke up, he told me that he had seen me sit up and crawl backwards to the edge of the bed and stand up in front of our bedroom door from the corner of his eye. He thought it was weird, but I got up like that because I'm in the last month of my pregnancy and I can't really move so well without it hurting. So he tried talking to me, but when I didn't answer, he said that he looked at the door to find me not there and still sleeping in bed. I got really creeped out, and I finally told him about what I have been seeing in the bathroom. He thought it was creepy as well, but didn't want to really talk about it anymore, because he thinks it will give whatever it is power or energy. I have no idea what it wants, or why we have both seen it, but if you have any idea, please let me know. Also, as you're getting ready for bed tonight, walking out the bathroom, take a peek behind you towards the mirror and see if your own reflection is looking at you as you walk out.